Derrick Bell and Jim Sleeper, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you this question that I've asked everybody in this series. How wide do you think the racial divide is in America today?
I just feel pulled in two directions about this. On the one hand, there's no question statistical measures of segregation, of neighborhoods being more segregated, are troubling. Instances of racial violence. There's tremendous fighting going on. There's great distance. On the other hand, I feel that on another level, there's an intimacy such as there hasn't been in the past. We've always sort of haunted one another's thoughts. Blacks and whites have been locked into such a tight psychic engagement throughout these years. And through thick and thin, the number of interracial marriages and relationships continues to rise. New generations come along with attitudes that I think are different, are more malleable. And I think that we have to get away from assuming that every evidence of white exasperation or intransigence is the same thing as the blood-gut racism of the Klan.
I think Jim has a point with regard to this. There are a lot more people who kind of get along well and interact and what have you. But the overall scene is I think, not very hopeful. One of the things that confuses all of us, I think, is the difference between now and 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Now the signs are down. And now no one, even those who we think are most racist, want to claim the tag racism. Rather than exclusion or prejudice, what we have is preference. The restaurants, and you and I can go into fancy restaurants in Midtown New York and be well served. Our children, if they went in tomorrow asking for waiters' jobs, would likely not be hired, you see. It's amazing. We have more civil rights laws on the books than at any time in our history. And the fact is there's probably more discrimination. It's of a different level, no signs over the door. But people who don't want to hire my children for jobs, don't hire them, and nothing happens to them. People that don't want to sell you a house or rent an apartment to me, don't do it, and for the most part, nothing happens to them. Does that mean that these laws are useless, we should throw them away? Probably not. But we should recognize that discrimination is now sufficiently subtle and sophisticated that those who want to discriminate do so.
Let's talk for a minute about perceptions, because they seem to be so radically different.
I think a lot of whites feel an exasperation based on perceptions that they have about black leadership, about the way the shots have been called, about the fact that they are all being accused of having an invidious racist intent. You get a kind of wagon circling. You get a kind of tit for tat.
You think that's happening?
Oh, I think it has happened tremendously, sure.
Well, give me a quick example.
Well, I think these sensationalized criminal justice trials like the Tawana Brawley case and the Central Park jogger case, we've seen leaders almost sabotage cases, twist evidence to convince black people that the system is inherently racist and won't work for them. Now,
and the result of that is?
The result of that
in
is,
those instances,
it induces a kind of communal paroxysm, a kind of communal despair, a kind of acting out of the rage, which doesn't go anywhere because it wins no allies among people of goodwill, even among most blacks, I must say. I think it siphons off a portion of the community into a kind of a tantrum that doesn't really lead to a strategy. For 10 years, I lived in central Brooklyn and ran a small newspaper and was active in black politics and neighborhood politics and very much immersed in the life of the city. And I realized, if anything, I deepened my sense that most blacks don't want people making excuses for any kind of bad behavior on the grounds of historic racial oppression. They want people, whites and others, to pay them the compliment of holding them to the same standards that they hold one another to in order to survive every day in neighborhoods like the ones I lived in.
Derrick, Jim Sleeper has alluded to a failure on the part of black leadership to face up to its responsibilities. Do you see that as a problem?
I think we're talking, each of us are to give perception, so I kind of remain quiet and listen to what I think is, if it's Jim's perception with his background, God knows it must be the perception of a lot of other whites. Mm-hmm. I think a part of it, maybe not for Jim, but for a lot, is this sense that anything. Remember, Martin Luther King was not loved during his life. He was seen as one of those bad leaders. The letter from the Birmingham jail was a response to other ministers because he was being criticized for going too fast, for these protests, for not simply praying and letting it go at that. You see, so that anything out of the accepted is seen as a problem by an awful lot of whites. When Louis Farrakhan speaks to his audience, he upsets a hell of a lot of white people, you see. But while he is speaking to the needs and the hopes and what have you of the people to whom he is speaking, and that's just going to happen.
Let's get to this issue, though, of perception as Jim Sleeper defined it, in which many things are, race becomes the sort of overarching issue. For example, the trial, the Central Park jogger, which is a national thing, not a local thing, the Tawana Brawley thing. You think, is there any possibility that race is being overplayed in this, or is there a valid role for the issue of race there?
I think probably not. The perceptions are different. If we could do a study and show, yes, well, blacks overplayed race on this, it could be explained by the fact that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, that incident or this police brutality situation is part of a long pattern. That was the Rodney King situation. If there had not been a pattern, both in Los Angeles and across the country, of police brutality against upper middle class blacks, not just blacks with police records, this would never have created the kind of thing. It's only because it fits into the pattern. So to say that, well, we blew up that incident too much, or this one, you may be right, but it doesn't alter the fact that it comes as an explosion out of a pattern of behavior.
Isn't this precisely the heart of the matter? I mean, something as fundamental as this. Two intelligent men who basically come from the same sense of, it seems to me, values and concerns about society, seeing this. How do you narrow this gap? Because this is fundamentally the problem.
Well, and plus, did you see a couple of times Jim, not Louis Farrakhan.
Right.
Well,
No,
see, I see Louis Farrakhan as a great hero for the people. I don't agree with everything he says and some of his tactics or whatever, but hell, I don't agree with everything anybody
Well, would you
says.
agree on this? There's the element of personal responsibility, the responsibility of leaders to take care in the way they define and project situations. Not to say that Tawana Brawley was raped if you don't have evidence that she was. That's a responsibility that you cannot fob off on 200 years of white racism. There are certain things that people have to do in the here and now, even as fighters for justice. At the same time, there is the 200 years. There are the patterns that Derrick spoke about. And for my sake, or from my point of view, the only kind of leader I can respect is one who shows the double vision, who is aware of the patterns, who understands them, but never uses them as an excuse for behavior that is just that vilifies opponents, that dehumanizes people of one's own camp, that tells deliberate lies. Those two things ultimately don't lead anywhere.
That brings me back to the Rodney King question. Given all of these variables, can we all get along?
We can, if each side, speaking racially, takes some extraordinary steps, makes some extraordinary public gestures. Whites clearly have to do things to demonstrate that the cops who beat Rodney King and the jurors who acquitted them don't speak for whites. I think there are things that blacks have to do too, that black leaders have to do. And we would be wrong to come away from this without saying that there are strategies that protest leadership has to reassess. Like giving Sister Souljah a platform at a convention after she has said on national TV what she had said.
Well, see, that's exactly the point.
It's a gesture, and only a gesture, and I understand that. Yeah. But we have to make decisions about how we choose, what foot we choose to put forward, all of us.
The problem is, Jim, is what you're really saying, although your intent is blacks, in order to kind of move ahead, to get along, have to put forward more often than they would like the subordinate foot. And I'm afraid that that's just not going to happen. I would answer your question by saying that I'm not sure we can get along. I think that we are in a very dire time, that the parallels with the late 1900s are very, very real. And by the turn, meaning more hostility, more violence, more separation, particularly as our economic situation grows worse, as it's much more likely to do than get better.
And I would say that if times are going to be as bad as Derrick suggests, and they may be, our margin for error, and by that I mean white liberals, blacks, people who are addressing this problem, is much narrower than usual. And what that means is not that blacks have to put forward a subordinate foot, but that, yes, there is a certain, when your back is to the wall and you need to find allies, you can't afford to do things that gratuitously alienate people who might be your allies. There is that middle group of whites who are waiting, almost yearning, for somebody to say something that, short of being accusatory, offers some common ground. And I don't think we've been hearing much of it said.
Well, then let me ask you to respond just briefly to another point that's come up in the discussion in recent days with the Sister Soldier comment and everything. The notion that black people cannot be racist simply because of the legacy of oppression and slavery and victimization.
Well, the thing is, we certainly can't hate whites. Now that, and I mean, if we didn't, either as individual bad people or what have you, we wouldn't be human. Racism, though, connotes power or connection with power, and that blacks don't have. So that you might not like a statement by Sister Soldier or Jesse Jackson or Louis Farrakhan or what have you, but they don't have the power to inflict policy based on those statements.
And that's your definition of racism.
It makes a difference. Now, I think one of the things that whites fear is that they might, and that fear is justified.
I disagree with that because I believe that if blacks settle for a definition of power that is just along racial lines, they are, in a sense, and thereby categorize all whites as being implacably on the wrong side of the issue, they are settling for something that amounts to racism. No, they're not being racist in the same sense that their perception has the ability to thwart the aspirations of whites. But yes, they are being racist in the sense that it is drawing something vital out of a common enterprise. It is crippling, in a sense, whites as well as blacks. The original sin is white racism, and whites have to come to terms with that. But the idea that blacks, in settling for that definition, can't make it worse, I think that's wrong. I think you do have the power to make it worse, to make it irremediably worse.
Derrick Bell, what keeps you going if you're so pessimistic about the possibility of solving this problem in America?
I think you try to figure out what is your life about. And I was working as a civil rights lawyer in the 60s, and down in this rural Mississippi county that I had talked these people into trying to desegregate the schools 10 years prematurely, as I now think. And I was walking up this dusty road with Mrs. Biona McDonald. I think she's since died. And I said, Miss McDonald, they're trying to foreclose your mortgage in town. They fired your sons from their job. They even shot through your house last week, I understand. Why do you do it? And she said, Derrick, I'm an old lady. I live to harass white folks. And the marvelous thing about it, Charlayne, the way those neighborhoods, she lived near whites who were supportive of her. So she wasn't talking, it wasn't a racial thing, but she knew that those people who were oppressing her were white. She knew that she didn't have their power, she didn't have their money, she certainly didn't have their guns. But she saw her life as giving them trouble, being on the case all the time. And I've accepted that as my motto. I live to harass white folk. So those at Harvard and some of the other places need to be on guard.
But to what end, Derrick?
Because the basis of life, it seems to me, is to recognize bad stuff, recognize evil, and try to do something. It doesn't mean that you can change it. It means that you recognize it and you oppose it. So by harassing what I see as evil in racism and in racial policies, I do that which I think justifies my existence. And out of that, sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, but win or lose, I am on the case.
And what about you, Jim Sleeper? You live to harass anybody?
I guess I have a tremendous sense of exasperation, both at racism and at responses to racism that unwittingly, I think, only reinforce the circle. And I'm just trying to break the circle. That's how I feel.
Well, Jim Sleeper and Derrick Bell, thank you.
Thank you, Charlayne.
Pleasure.